Hello and welcome to another episode of Revolution Radio. Today in the studio you have Tanya and
Jay.
and today is a Wednesday and it's actually been a very busy day. We have a call-in coming soon, hopefully. He's kind of an important fella. His name is Ben Norton. Jay, can you tell us about Ben Norton?
Ben is one of the best journalists, I would say. I don't know. I don't want to even just say like American journalist, but
No, because he travels everywhere.
A lot of
Yeah.
politics. He has a lot of insight, domestic and obviously afar. But he's one of the few journalists that you can actually trust. He doesn't have an agenda. He's not paid by any big corporations on the left or the right. He actually, I don't know, does something that a lot of journalists don't do, and that's he actually travels to the places that he's reporting on.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm very excited to have him in. Really, really nice guy, really cool guy. I've been following him for a while, and when he reports something, he leaves his sources. He leaves, pretty much proof, and you're always taken back by why mainstream media isn't picking these things up. And
I'm always impressed by the stuff that he does post in the articles because he's there. He's actually witnessing it firsthand. And I think that's going to help a lot of our listeners because he's actually been there. He's living it. And I think that a lot of people need to understand that.
Yeah, there's a few guys and women out there doing amazing journalism. I think there's probably more than get credit for, to be honest. Eva Bartlett, Max Blumenthal, Aaron Matei, Ben Norton. There is a list of these that you can follow, and you're going to have journalistic integrity. Where if you're a big, Hannity guy or Rachel Maddow, it's all going to become. For one, it's going to be clickbait. And if it's not clickbait, it's pushing a narrative that, I would say has also lined your pockets, or at least the company you work for. And that's not what these guys do. Gray Zone and a lot of other publications.
Yes.
In fact, I think recently I turned you on to RT.
You did, and
as far as news, and I swear to God, that's all I go to now.
I appreciate that, and I think for me it matters more that you're not just reporting on one side. It's all sides. You're not sugarcoating anything. This is what's happening now, and I think that means a lot more to other people too. They just don't know it yet.
Right, and like for our show, where I'm gonna say 50%, 40% is news. 60% is banter and maybe news stories, but they are like the Jim Cummings,
Yeah.
And making fun of things. So when I do set out news stories, I want them to be from a credible source, and I want them to have some integrity to them.
Not Fox News.
Right. Although sometimes those are fun to report on too, but
they entertain me.
It bugs me because it's not even like I pride ourselves really on our news. I think we cover the current events and we cover what we see and what we read and whatever. I don't say like, hey, we're going to be the ones who are going to break stories, because we're not. We're 3 people, 5 people at max who get around and discuss what's going on, and a lot of times we're just there to crack shit and,
that does remind me, though.
And let people know about stuff.
Because you said 3. We're not 3 today. Cody is still out with the... I don't even know what the hell he has anymore.
Well, I was just going to say, though, my point I was going to... was that we have more integrity on what we're reporting than these other...
Oh, 1 sec. All right. right. And from the ding dongs and ringing, that means that our guest has called in. And I would just like to say, welcome to Revolution Radio, Mr. Ben Norton. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a real honor to have you, definitely. Because we're a show that, as we were saying before, we do, I would say 60% of it is just banter and comedy and things like that. And then 40% is current events and news. And you're one of those people who has so much journalistic integrity and has got us reporting on actual stories instead of things like Russiagate and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you're definitely someone we're honored to have.
Okay, so I see you guys are just Kremlin shills, obviously.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
That's what I got out of it. No, but thank you. I do appreciate that in all seriousness. And, you know, I don't want to necessarily imply as if everyone who works in the corporate media is they're all bad people, because there are good people, but then the problem is institutional, of course. The problem is systemic, and people who have integrity and who are willing to act on that integrity and want to actually challenge power, they're not promoted, they're not rewarded, and the people who are deferent to power, who toe the party line, and who don't rock the boat, those are the ones who are promoted and rewarded. So, unfortunately, it's not that I'm some great person, it's that within the apparatus of the corporate media as an institution, these people like me, we don't rise up.
Yeah.
What made you, turn down opportunities for? Because I'm sure MSNBC and places like that have offered you positions. What has kept you? What has kept you to be, to have such integrity?
Well, I think what's interesting about my case, and I think this is one of there are a few different reasons, but one of the primary reasons is I don't have to work in media, and I could go do something else. And in fact, there are many other jobs in which you could actually probably help your community more directly than through media. The thing about working in media is it's the long game, right? And it's not mutually exclusive. You can do other things at the same time. But a friend of mine who's also a good muckraking journalist, Adam Johnson, whom you might know, he's said this point a lot, and I agree with it, that one of the reasons that we are able to, not give an F, right, in the same way and be more aggressive muckraking journalists is because if it doesn't work out, we can just go do other work. And there are a lot of opportunists, there are a lot of professionalists who see media as their profession, not just something that they're doing for the good of society, for political reasons. I'm a journalist through and through, absolutely. I don't consider myself an activist. I don't organize protests and things like that. That's not my cup of tea, or I don't think that's necessarily a role that I'm effective in. But I also see my journalism as something very political. I see it as playing a political role in society as part of something larger, like social movements, like activists.
Yeah,
and in fact, I see many activists as more of my colleagues and comrades than I do other journalists who are only interested in being a professional journalist and making a living and being on TV. So having that different attitude is important because as a journalist, I don't think my responsibility is to get as many bylines. I could care less about being in the New York Times or the Washington Post, the Bezos Post. I'm much more interested in having a political impact and in helping to shine light on issues that need more light shined on them, that are being ignored by corporate media. So that's really a fundamentally different philosophy. And unfortunately, there aren't that many journalists who have that philosophy because, like I said, we work within corporate media. We live in a capitalist system. So journalism is seen as a job, as a profession, and not as a political activity you do for society.
And see, I think that's what makes you perfect to be a journalist, taking that role of not how can I make money in this profession, but what can I do to help people, and going with that narrative. At least in my belief, that's kind of what journalism was supposed to be about a long time ago, and it has been, mutated. And I think that's what makes you really good at it, and that's where things like RT and even to an extent like the Young Turks and some other digital media should be our mainstream media instead of the what we have now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And again, it's also just about understanding what your role is as a journalist. And we don't talk a lot about role because if you talk about role, it's like, oh, that's very authoritarian. We don't have roles. We all just do what we want. We have this very individualist mentality that I just do what makes me happy. But it's like, no, I think people, they don't have some preordained role. It's like, I'm not a Calvinist. I don't think that some deity, secular or religious, gave us a role that we have to fulfill, but that you can play different roles in a larger social movement, in a larger society. And like I said, I wouldn't call myself an activist, but I see activists as colleagues in the sense that we are fighting toward a similar goal, right? Like as a journalist, I'm interested in challenging power, in pushing back against moves toward war everywhere, pushing back against imperialism, fighting for justice, exposing injustices. Like these are all parts of a larger social movement. And then there are activists who use that information to help organize and fight for a better society. Whereas some people, at least they ostensibly say that their goal is to inform people. But what does it mean to inform people? Are you a professor? Are you a teacher? Because teachers are informing people too. They just play a different role. And frankly, a lot of journalists, because they have this mentality, it's a passive mentality instead of an active one. They simply go along with how the corporate media is structured, which is not about informing people. It's about advertising revenue. And once you think about it in that way, the role of the corporate media is not to inform people, and therefore the role of journalists who act passively, who don't push back against it, their role is not necessarily to inform people. It's to make ad revenue for the shareholders, for the media corporation they work for. And there are some rare exceptions, and there are people who push back against that system, people like Matt Taibbi, who do great work and who can work within that framework. But again, it's a matter of active pushing back and not simply passive resistance or passive work.
Yeah, it seems like when you're discussing corporate media, that they all meet together, and there's a certain like Fox News, or said, okay, we're going to run with this story, you oppose us, and it's the same narrative pushed every day. I don't know how if there's any truth to the fact that they get the same news from the same sources, and it's just I don't know, almost spoon-fed to us. But it's interesting how CNN, MSNBC, they're all covering the exact same thing, just with a little bit different spin to it.
Well, I think there are a few reasons for that. One is the institutional reason, which I was discussing. And I keep talking about the institutionality because it's important to understand the corporate media as a corporate apparatus. That's why I always say corporate. I don't like the term mainstream because it's not specific. What is the mainstream media? Corporate media is specific. These are for-profit corporations, and their ostensible goal is to inform people, ostensibly, but their actual goal is to make money. And it's not necessarily that, in fact, I strongly disagree, and I'm not saying you're implying it, but I strongly disagree with this notion that they meet together and decide what they're going to talk about that week. It's even more ridiculous than that. It's that the vast majority of corporate media outlets, for a variety of reasons. One, because again, they're trying to make money, so they're just going to do what's popular and what will get viewers. Right, but two, because the way these corporations are run, there are so many internal institutional incentives for people just to go along with whatever the hot-ish story is. If, for instance, if you're a producer at MSNBC and you have to do 24/7 or however much news you're doing, you're just going to go along with whatever is in the headlines right now because it's easy, you're going to get viewers, your ratings are going to be great. But if you're trying to do investigative work and bring new topics and broach new issues, which audiences might not be familiar with, which your bosses and the hosts might not be familiar with, that can be daunting. And a lot of people who work in business, they don't like making risks like that because they could lose that potential advertising revenue. They could lose viewers. Their ratings could go down. So there are all these incentives just to keep everything boring, insipid, and going along with the same stories. This is why Russiagate was so popular, and this is why when Van Jones, even though Van Jones was privately recorded by a right-wing, I won't even name him, but a right-wing propagandist who would not call a journalist. But it's true that the footage of Van Jones shows him admitting that Russiagate was a big nothing burger, which it was. It was a big nothing burger, and they knew that. That's the cynicism of it. They knew that there was nothing behind the story, but it led to MSNBC having record high ratings. It led to specifically Rachel Maddow having the most popular primetime television show on cable news. There are so many internal incentives just to keep focusing on the same story. And then finally, the other angle that I didn't mention, but this is an equally important factor, is that when it comes to certain issues, primarily international issues, these corporate networks are all so homogenous in their coverage because they're getting their coverage fed to them by the US government. And investigative journalism is basically extinct at this point. Very few people, including print journalists, are doing original investigative work for a variety of reasons. One, it's expensive. Two, it takes a long time. And three, because we've gotten to a point with digital media where we churn out so much content that journalists are expected to produce an article a day, if not more. So people don't have the time and energy and resources to do good investigative work. So there's this feedback loop where we just keep focusing on the same stories again and again and again. And that's exacerbated by the fact that the New York Times and Washington Post, who are creating these stories in the news cycle, are often just being fed stories by press releases from the Pentagon, press releases from the CIA, from what people call unofficial leaks, or even official leaks. So you have, for instance, people in the Pentagon or the CIA decide that they're going to selectively leak information to the press because they can't publicly admit it, but they want it to be exposed. And we have seen this kind of leak war in the Trump administration where one agency will leak something to the press. Anyway, I mean, I can talk more about that, but the point that I'm making, the basic point to keep in mind, is that these corporate media outlets are not digging and trying to find a story most of the time. They're actually just being given the story by the Pentagon or by the CIA or by whomever or by politicians. And journalists like to be given a scoop because you don't have to put much time and energy into it. And their bosses and editors love when journalists are handed scoops because they can get an original story without spending much time and energy on it. So I could talk more about those specific details. I know there's a lot that I just talked about there, but the point is that all of these factors are interrelated, and ultimately all it does is just reinforce the thesis of Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in Manufacturing Consent, that the corporate media as an apparatus exist to manufacture consent for these government policies, and it's a self-reinforcing feedback loop.
And to play devil's advocate on that just a little bit, how much do you think that is also consumers being responsible for? You can do a story about what's going on in Venezuela or Iran or so forth, but once you do something on something like marijuana or abortion, it picks up like crazy. And and news should not be something that's for ratings at all. But at what point do you think some of that does play a role? Or do you think maybe, and I don't want to give you just these two options, but do you think maybe the fact that these corporate media, they do push the abortion story so much, and so they give consumers a predetermined idea so they feel much more comfortable discussing these issues instead of what's, like something like Venezuela?
Well, this is a complex question, and it has a complex answer, and of course the answer is dialectical, right? Not to engage in cliches, but it is dialectical in the sense that the output and input both feed into each other. So this might sound a little abstract, but I'm going to make an analogy to economics. There was a French economist who was a classical liberal economist in the 18th and 19th century named Jean-Baptiste Say. And there's a famous economic law called Say's law. And basically the idea of it is that supply makes its own demand. So when you have a supply of something economically, the fact that you have so much of it creates more demand for it economically. And that has a lot of implications in terms of economics, but I actually think it's equally true for understanding not just media interests, but also art, aesthetic interests, what people like. And we can't understand culture and society as something static. It's, of course, something that changes, and people don't just like something necessarily because they like it. So music tastes change every several years. Tastes in movie aesthetics change. And similarly, tastes in the news cycle change. And that's not an organic process. It's a process that, sure, does come from people organically to an extent. And there is a grassroots element. But at the same time, it's a very top-down process. And corporate media outlets decide what's going to be in the news cycle. And people who watch and read that media coverage then internalize those issues, and then they come to see them as important. And it's a self-reinforcing dialectical feedback loop. So for instance, if corporate media outlets spend, case study here, hours upon hours upon hours every day for 2 years focusing on Trump-Russia collusion, of course people are going to start believing that's an important issue because they see it every single day on the TV, on the internet, in their newspapers. Every single day they're fed this story again and again and again. So then the supply creates its own demand. There's so much of that supply that people think it's important and they want to follow it. So they begin asking more about it. And it's a dialectical feedback loop. And it's really hard to break through that because you raise a good point. Let's say you're a progressive producer at MSNBC, even a radical one, and you want to broach some of these issues that are being ignored by the media. Okay, that's great. I know some people, in fact, who are producers at MSNBC who try to do precisely this. The problem is everything is based on ratings. So you say, okay, look, I have this story idea, and it's going to be really popular. We're going to get a lot of ratings, right? But we have not covered it before. Say it's the war in Yemen, which they barely cover. Say it's Venezuela. And you might actually be able to get good ratings from it. That's a possibility. But you might actually not get good ratings, and people don't watch it. And then the producers say, look, that was an interesting story, and it was important, but we didn't get many viewers. So who are you going to blame for that? Now, you can blame people themselves for not being as interested, but why are they not interested? It's because they don't know anything about this issue because the media doesn't cover it. So why aren't people as interested in the war in Yemen? I mean, there is an interest now, and we can talk about why that is. Because of Khashoggi, because the CIA turned against Mohammed bin Salman, because of all these issues, because Trump is now leading the war in Yemen and not Obama. But anyway, the point is, several years ago, and even still today, there was very, very little popular interest and popular demand in coverage of the war in Yemen. Is it because people are stupid and ignorant? No. It's just because the corporate media never covered that issue and people didn't even really know about it, and they didn't know they should be interested in it, and they didn't know that their government is playing a key role in that war. So, I mean, I could talk about this contradiction for a long time, but I think you probably see the point I'm making that it's easy to blame people, and maybe sometimes the public does bear some responsibility, but there's a reason that each generation likes the same kind of music. And there are exceptions, but there's a reason that there are cultural and social fads, and it's because there's a music industry, right, that creates taste, that the supply creates its own demand. You see all of this music being put in major records, being put on YouTube, being put on MTV, and then people, they hear it at clubs and at stores, and people develop a taste, and they learn to like that music generationally. And then there are exceptions. There are people who say, oh, this music sucks, and we should be doing this other kind of music. But that's always going to be on the fringe. And alternative media and corporate media work in a very similar way.
Yeah, I would agree. If I could add one more thing, I also think, too, where there's political aspects to the stories as well. meaning like you were talking about with Yemen. There's a story. Well, I'll just go back to the Yemen reference. But if you're on a certain side politically, like if you're on the left, you seem to care more than if you're on the right. But if it's something having to do with like Israel and the Gaza Strip, you care more on the right than on the left, so to speak. And yeah, I see that a lot just with regular people. There's a story with that Eddie Gallagher, who was in the Marines, and I've gotten so much pushback on. I just shared the story. I didn't comment on it, and I've gotten so much pushback from people who are conservatives, and they are like, who cares? You know, all is fair in love and war. Blah 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 blah. You know, and not that I don't take a side really when it comes to this either, but I just said, you know, it's interesting how you didn't have this blasé kind of way of seeing it when we were talking about like Benghazi, you know. And so yeah, I do think some of that has to do with where you're at politically. And
it's a huge part of it, and thinking of it in how the way that tastes are manufactured and crafted, right? Thinking of these institutions. So I'll make an analogy to music again really quickly. So you have Columbia Records, you have these record labels that monopolize certain genres. And so, for instance, why is trap so popular right now? I mean, I'm personally a big fan of trap. I like it. But trap was not popular a few years ago. It's become popular within the hip-hop scene because music record labels and music corporations, especially distribution companies, have decided that it's profitable and they're going to use this. And again, supply creates its demand, and that people learn to start liking trap, and they develop an aesthetic interest. Hip-hop fans develop an aesthetic interest in trap. Similarly, there are large institutions and corporations like the RNC and DNC, the Republican and Democratic parties, that shift over time, and the institutions that are affiliated with them, like MSDNC, MSNBC, and like Fox News, each being the kind of corporate media extensions, arms of the Republican Democratic parties, they shift over time and they create the kind of the platforms that are discussed, the issues that are broached. So in the case of Fox News, actually, it's interesting to see this kind of political realignment under Trump. What is now relatively common, even mainstream for Republicans, a few years ago was not. It was actually on the fringe of the Republican Party. So, for instance, now George Bush and John McCain are more popular among Democrats, mainstream neoliberal Democrats, than they are among Republicans. In fact, John McCain is loathed by many Republicans. So there's this split where this kind of Pat Buchanan style, Pat Buchanan, I was combining him with Bakunin, very different, but actually not that different. Pat Buchanan style, Buchananite Republicans have become really the mainstream of the Republican Party. And there's been this alignment. So now mainstream Republicans actually don't support these free market neoliberal capitalist policies. They support protectionist policies. They support even embargoes. They support tariffs on Chinese goods and things like that. So those issues have become mainstream within the Republican Party. Fox News is talking about the importance of tariffs. It's no longer talking about the importance of the free market. And there's been a political realignment. Similarly, on MSNBC talks about how George Bush actually wasn't that bad of a guy. And MSNBC talks about how John McCain was a great American hero, of course, whitewashing both of these war criminals.
Yeah.
And similarly, Democrats begin to, especially kind of upper middle class neoliberal Democrats, begin to absorb these ideas. Now, at the same time, I don't want to discount the grassroots and the masses of people, because they play a key role in this, in pushing back against this institutional momentum that wants to move in particular directions. But then you have the masses that are pushing back against these institutions and saying, no, John McCain is a war criminal. No, George Bush is a war criminal who has the blood of a million Iraqis on his hand. But, I mean, again, this is a kind of long sociological argument. But the point that we just simply need to understand is that these tastes and interests are not entirely organic. They're crafted. And whether or not they're crafted by large corporate media outlets, by Hollywood, by music companies, by many things, fashion. I mean, there are just many different tastes, and there's a dialectical process, and there's an element involved of the grassroots determining its own tastes, of communities deciding what they like. But then a lot of it really is top-down. And that's why it's not surprising to see that as the Republican and Democratic parties, the kind of mainstream core of it, the ruling apparatus within these parties, as they shift politically, the corporate media shifts correspondingly, and popular tastes shift correspondingly. Because again, this is how society is governed. This is how consent is manufactured in a liberal bourgeois capitalist democracy, where the media is the way that people mediate politics. Because if you do that, they don't really engage in politics. They elect representatives who engage in politics. So the way of holding those representatives accountable is through the media, and then the way that these parties shift people's public interests and political ideas is also through that media.
Yeah, no, I mean, just like how you had a lot of Democrats who came out against the idea of Trump pulling troops out of Syria, and really that's what we've wanted for a long time. It was, not to be in regime change wars, not to be involved in military actions that we perpetrate. But as soon as Trump says it, it's a bad idea, we shouldn't do it. So yeah, but I don't want to take up too much of your time on this, because I did specifically ask you here to talk about Venezuela and Iran, and I want to start on Venezuela first. Just a quick rundown for anyone who's not caught up, and if I'm wrong, please fill in any gaps here. But in Venezuela, Juan Guaido claimed election fraud. He announced himself as interim president. He claims a lot of poverty. He said people are eating out of trash cans. And that's why he should be in place, because of this election fraud. And, he then, and by the way, after he did declare himself as interim president, Mike Pence or Donald Trump, one of the two, tweeted almost immediately in support of him, as well as many others. And that's kind of where we were at. Am I correct there?
Partially, for the most part. One key issue, though, that you said, and I'm glad you said it, because it reflects a media myth. Guaido did not really declare election fraud. The thing is, Guaido is part of a party called Voluntad Popular, the Popular Will Party, which is the most right-wing, extreme party within the Venezuelan opposition, which is very fragmented and divided. He didn't declare election fraud. His party boycotted the May 2018 presidential election. There was an election last year in Venezuela. In fact, we just passed the first anniversary of it. And the main opposition parties boycotted that election voluntarily. They refused to participate in the presidential election. They, of course, claimed that, the election is rigged, Venezuela is no longer a democracy, but they were the ones who voluntarily decided not to participate. However, there were more centrist opposition parties that did participate in the election, and the irony is that if the opposition hadn't been so divided and they actually ran in the election, they probably would have won. But as I stressed, and this is a key point, the opposition in Venezuela is very divided. There are really 5 parties. There are more than 5, but there are really 5 kind of major opposition parties, ranging from kind of centrists to the extreme right wing. And of course, the Trump administration has decided to take the extreme right wing and try to install it in power undemocratically. But the point is that Venezuela is still a democracy. It still has regular elections. And the opposition for years now has tried to do everything it can, especially since the death of Hugo Chavez in 2013, but even before, to derail the democratic processes. So let's go back a bit. Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998 for the first time. This is important because Venezuela had an actual military dictatorship, and the military dictatorship was overthrown in 1958. And then from 1958 until 1998, Venezuela was governed by a two-party dictatorship, if you will. Every few years, one party, COPE, the Christian Democrats, the kind of center-right party, every year they would switch power with Acción Democrática, Democratic Action Party, which is like the centrist neoliberal party that claims to be liberal, more left-wing, but they're just neoliberal centrists. So every year they would switch power, and there was just, a kind of typical neoliberal governance structure. In 1998, Hugo Chavez, who's this military officer who was extremely popular, and I don't have time to talk about more of his history, but anyway, he's elected, and the Fifth Republican Movement Party was the name of his party. It was not the Socialist Party at the time. He's elected, and he ushers in and begins the process of what is called the Bolivarian Revolution. So he begins to drastically cut poverty, boost social spending, fund education programs and healthcare. And Hugo Chavez won 6 democratic elections until his death in 2013. He also passed a constitutional referendum that was voted on democratically. The Carter Center, founded by former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who monitored the 1998 and 1999/2000, it's complicated, elections, because there were a lot of elections, 1998, 1999, and 2000. The Carter Center monitored those elections and said that they were some of the freest and fairest in the world. And Jimmy Carter personally monitored the elections. The Carter Center said that Venezuela has the best election system in the world in terms of the technology. Now, in 2002, in April, the U.S. government, under then President George Bush, backed a military coup against the elected government of Hugo Chavez. No one contested in any way that Chavez was freely and fairly elected, but the U.S. still overthrew him in a military coup. And that says a lot, and I'm stressing this history because it shows that the U.S. has no interest in democracy in Venezuela. They overthrew Venezuelan democracy in 2002, but Hugo Chavez was so popular that masses of people came out in the streets, flooded the streets of the country. The military rebelled, and they reinstalled the elected president, Hugo Chavez. And after that, there was an oil lockout, and there were numerous attempts to destabilize the Venezuelan economy and overthrow Chavez unsuccessfully. And he governed through numerous democratic elections freely and fairly until 2013. No one disputes that. What has happened since 2013 is there have been economic difficulties in Venezuela, and we can talk about that. But there still are elections. When Chavez died in 2013, there was a presidential election, and Nicolás Maduro, who was his vice president and was Chavez's successor, he was democratically elected president. And that leads us more toward today. And we can talk about the specific instances leading to today, but the point is that Venezuela is still a democracy, and the opposition has been divided and unable to defeat the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, which is the party that Chavez later created. They've been unable to unseat them through elections. So, with the election of Trump, they decided new tactics. Mike Pompeo, former CIA director, now Secretary of State, was working with the opposition, was telling them they should boycott the elections and refuse to participate. And then there were also the violent guarimbas, the violent barricades and attacks on the state and attacks on Chavistas of 2014 and in 2017, where the extreme opposition was actually killing Chavistas, lynching Chavistas, burning black Venezuelans alive, and attacking government facilities, attacking security forces. That leads us more toward today. And there's a lot I could talk about, but I'll just take a pause here and I'll say one final note that I was actually in Venezuela reporting in February and March earlier this year, and I was honestly very impressed. I knew that Venezuela was still a democracy, but I was impressed that in many ways, and I swear I'm not being hyperbolic, in many ways Venezuela is still more democratic than our own government here in the United States. For instance, I went to numerous right-wing opposition protests in Venezuela, and there are some, certainly. They're not huge, but there are some. And they're in largely white, affluent, wealthy neighborhoods like Chacao. And I went to numerous protests, and people were protesting, and I didn't see any police anywhere. There were no police in sight. And this is supposedly a police state, a dictatorship? No, there is still a vibrant political opposition. In fact, opposition leaders like Juan Guaido, like Maria Corina Machado, like Leopoldo Lopez, have been working with the U.S. government to try to overthrow their own elected government. And Leopoldo Lopez was just removed from house arrest illegally by military coup mongers and is hiding in the Spanish embassy. Juan Guaido is walking around freely without being arrested, even though he's conspiring with a foreign government to overthrow his own government. Maria Corina Machado is also walking around. I saw her with my eyes speaking at a protest, and she's conspiring with the Trump administration to overthrow her government. We're supposed to believe this is a dictatorship? In what kind of dictatorship do politicians, elected opposition politicians, conspire with a foreign state to overthrow their president and then walk around freely? Can you imagine if Nancy Pelosi was actually conspiring with Russia to overthrow Donald Trump? We would never hear the end of it. She would be in prison. She might even be hanged. But the point is that Venezuela, although it has issues, we can talk about it, it certainly has issues. Venezuela still is certainly a democracy, and Juan Guaido was never elected president. He was appointed president by the Trump administration. The only reason we even know about him is because when he self-declared on January 23rd, it was because they had planned it for weeks before with the Trump administration. It's because the day before, on January 22nd, Mike Pence personally called Juan Guaido, and Mike Pence said, yes, this is a green light. Tomorrow, self-declare president, and we and 24 other right-wing imperialist countries who have been conspiring for weeks, we will recognize you to try to overthrow your elected president. This was all planned. It has nothing to do with freedom and democracy. It has been a coup out in the open. The Wall Street Journal has been openly reporting on the fact that it was a planned coup. No one is hiding it. And the fact that anyone who pretends to be on the left can pretend like this is anything other than a Trump-led right-wing coup attempt, it shows how ridiculously right-wing the so-called left is in the U.S. The Democrats are, the neoliberals are.
Now, you make a great point earlier about what dictatorship would allow this. Yet you wouldn't see this in Saudi Arabia. You wouldn't see this in North Korea. And onto that as well, I did want to ask you, aside from, you did go into the economics state of Venezuela. Aside from what we're doing now, a lot of the sanctions that we held against Venezuela, not letting them do business internationally, didn't that play a huge role in, as we kind of tried to suffocate them from the inside out, did that play a huge role into the poverty that they're in? Or, yeah,
yes,
and that's not
the
a fair
U.S.
statement
sanctions,
either when I said poverty they're in, but yes, yeah.
Yes, the U.S. sanctions, and it's not just sanctions, the U.S. economic warfare have been one of the most important, if not the most important factor in the economic crisis in Venezuela today. And there is an economic crisis. It's true, absolutely. And to be fair, it is not the only factor. And briefly, I'll talk about what those factors are. But we must always keep in the back of our mind that probably the most important factor in destabilizing the Venezuelan economy and the country as a whole are the illegal, blatantly illegal U.S. sanctions and economic warfare. Now, let me stress that these sanctions have already killed Venezuelans, thousands upon thousands. In fact, a recent study by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and this economic study was co-authored by an award-winning renowned economist, Jeffrey Sachs, who's a professor at Columbia University, along with Mark Weisbrot. Their study shows that just in 2 years alone, in 2017 and 2018, the sanctions imposed by the Trump administration led to 40,000 preventable Venezuelan deaths. 40,000 preventable deaths. So we're already talking about mass death. And why did these Venezuelans die because of U.S. sanctions? Because one, U.S. sanctions are effectively a kind of economic blockade. They're a de facto financial blockade of Venezuela that are preventing the government from importing many things, including medicine, surgical equipment, medical goods, and medical equipment. The U.S. is holding the Venezuelan population hostage, essentially, and leading to preventable deaths that doctors and surgeons could otherwise cure and solve were it not for the U.S. sanctions. It's also exacerbated the food issues in Venezuela. One of the issues with Venezuela, and this is not an issue that's new to the Bolivarian Revolution, for 100 years, this has been a petrostate. It is an import-based economy. There's not a lot of domestic production other than oil. Now, the Chavez administration and the subsequent Maduro administration in the past 20 years have tried to diversify the economy. They have not been very successful because it's very difficult in a short period of time to diversify an economy after 100 years of being a petrostate and after hundreds of years of European colonialism as well. So certainly the fact that the U.S. sanctions have prevented the import of goods has meant that certain food products are unaffordable and difficult to find. When I was there, for instance, many dairy products are unaffordable. That's true. Certain meats are unaffordable, and that's because they're imported, and the U.S. sanctions have made it so difficult and expensive, prohibitively expensive to import, that only rich people can afford certain kinds of nice cheese, although it's not like cheese is cheap here either. Okay, so that's one of the answers. The other answer that's an important issue, the crippling U.S. sanctions, which are illegal, have been one factor, and they didn't start under Trump, they started under Obama. We need to keep that in mind. Another issue is the drop in oil prices. Now, I'll keep this simple, but because the entire Venezuelan economy relies on oil exports, it's true that it's not just the U.S.'s fault, although the U.S. plays a key role. What happened was, when Hugo Chavez died, and specifically in 2014, the price of oil plummeted on the international market by over 300%. Now, why did that happen? It was not some organic process. It was not the result of the invisible hand of the free market. It was a political strategy pursued by the U.S. government and other oil producers, primarily Saudi Arabia. Now, when Chavez was alive, he had exercised a much bigger role in OPEC, the oil producing and exporting countries. And he made sure that the global price of oil increased by decreasing the production, by decreasing the supply of oil in the global market, which increased the price of it. Saudi Arabia was working with the U.S., the Obama administration in 2014, to overturn that and to drop the price of oil. The Obama administration, in fact, John Kerry had a meeting with the Saudi king, and they made an agreement where the U.S. would boost its support for Salafi jihadi rebels, Contras, inside Syria, and in return, Saudi Arabia would overpump oil and drop the global price of oil on the market. You can find media reports from 2014 in which President Maduro, 5 years ago, says very explicitly the U.S. is waging this as a form of economic warfare to hurt the oil exporting countries of Venezuela, Iran, and Russia. In all three countries, their economies were heavily impacted by this. Saudi Arabia is a theocratic monarchy with virtually no economy, and Saudi Aramco is state-owned. So they were able to weather the economic impact of that by overproducing oil and imposing austerity measures. But that has actually backfired, and we've gotten to the point now where Saudi Arabia is bankrupting itself through the overproduction of low-priced oil and the war in Yemen. And that's why we actually see the price of oil now increasing, along with the fact that the Obama administration began using more domestic production of oil and began using natural gas. So it's a very complex process, and I won't blabber anymore, but the point is that certainly the Venezuelan government has made mistakes. They made mistakes with controlling the inflation and the currency. They have had issues dealing with the black market. It's very difficult. They've been sabotaged at every corner, and Maduro has been unable to govern in many ways because his hands are tied behind his back. And we need to keep in mind that, yes, okay, they're not perfect and have made mistakes, but they've been dealing with intense economic sabotage and warfare from the international community, and especially from the U.S., for years now, that have made it very difficult for them to govern effectively.
Yeah, I definitely see what you're saying, and totally. The one thing I was going to ask you too, when you're discussing, especially oil, is there any truth to the fact that the Trump administration has tried to take Citgo from Venezuela?
That is absolutely true. It's an objective fact. The Trump administration boasted about it, and I'm glad you mentioned this because the Trump administration has carried out so many aggressive acts of warfare against Venezuela. There's so many of them, it's easy to forget some of them. So you mentioned the Trump administration illegally stole Venezuela's largest foreign asset, illegally, in blatant violation of international law. There's no basis whatsoever. The Trump administration took Citgo, which has been referred to as the kind of crown jewel of the Venezuelan oil industry. This is the U.S.-based oil refinery. The U.S. simply stole it and handed it over to Juan Guaido to try to fund his fake coup regime that was unelected. And that's in addition to the other government assets of Venezuela that have been stolen illegally by, for instance, the Bank of England and by a major bank in Portugal. They have stolen billions upon billions of dollars of Venezuelan state assets. The Bank of England has stolen more than $1 billion of physical Venezuelan gold assets and prevented the Venezuelan government from accessing its own property in a foreign bank. This is economic international warfare against the elected government of Venezuela, and there is no basis whatsoever under international law for this. But of course, it's impossible to take international action against these banks and these countries because if there were action at the UN, the US and the Security Council would block any action and would likely prevent similar action in other UN bodies and the WTO. And of course, the World Bank and the IMF are also basically tools of Washington. And if you read the US Army's Unconventional Warfare Manual, which was leaked by WikiLeaks, you could see that they describe the World Bank and IMF as financial arms of U.S. imperial power. And that's, of course, why Julian Assange is now a political prisoner. It has nothing to do with his personal life. It's because he exposed crimes of the empire, and it's because he published things like that U.S. Army Unconventional Warfare Manual.
Right, yeah. And I also wanted to ask you, too, another thing. And I don't know if the two are related. I have heard this said many times on one side of the political spectrum that Vladimir Putin called Trump. They had a lengthy conversation, and the next day, Donald Trump came out and he said that he felt that John Bolton was too militaristic in Venezuela and we need to take a step back. I don't want to play into theories or conspiracies or anything of that nature. But, from somebody who is as learned as you are on Venezuela, has America decreased their military presence? Or I shouldn't say military presence, but their attempt to influence? And do you think it has anything to do with that phone call, if such said phone call existed?
If anything, I think it's a minor factor. It is not a major factor. Okay, sir, certainly it's possible that Putin had an influence on Trump. I mean, Trump believes anyone he just had a conversation with before, which is how you can see him tweet something that was on Fox News 5 minutes before, and Fox News knows that very well. But okay, let's just say that it had some kind of influence. I think the much more important influence on Trump making that declaration, and by the way, Trump didn't fire John Bolton. He just criticized some of John Bolton's policies. Trump is the one who appointed John Bolton the architect of one of the architects of the Iraq War, and unabashed neoconservative war hawk. Trump is the one who appointed him national security advisor, and he's still there. But regardless of that, the most important factor is that the coup attempt has failed. And Trump,
right.
if we can believe some of the corporate media reports on this, and I think they're probably true, the New York Times and Washington Post have reported that Trump is in fact becoming frustrated because Bolton and Pompeo reassured him that the coup attempt would be easy and that Maduro would fall in a few days, which is, of course, very similar to what happened in Syria. Everyone said, oh, yeah, Assad is just going to fall immediately. That's what they always say. When Saudi Arabia launched the war in Yemen with U.S. support, they said, oh, it was going to be a few weeks max. That this is the imperial hubris. They think that they are puppet masters who control the entire world, and that when things don't go exactly as they want, they always blame foreign boogeymen like Russia. The reality is that the U.S. coup attempt has been a complete disaster for a variety of reasons. It has utterly failed. Juan Guaido, 81% of Venezuelans had never even heard of this guy, this 35-year-old politician, before the Trump administration declared him president. He's unpopular inside Venezuela, and very few people had known about him. And also, the military has remained loyal to the government. The Trump administration has now has overseen 2 military coup attempts, at least that we know of, and both of these putsches have failed miserably. So, for instance, there was one right before May Day, ironically, on April 30th, there was another military coup attempt, and Guaido said, okay, the military is going to rise up with me. And 25 soldiers rose up with him. 25. That's laughable. Venezuela has an enormous military. So the fact that Trump made those remarks, okay, maybe Putin had a minor influence on him, but Trump made those remarks after that second military coup attempt failed. And Trump was reassured, oh, it's going to work this time. Oh, it's going to work this time. He's been told that again and again and again since January 23rd, and I think he's become frustrated. Now, Trump is not a very smart guy, but it's been now 4 months tomorrow. Today's the 22nd. Tomorrow is the 4th month anniversary of this most recent coup attempt that began, and they still have not had any success whatsoever. So I think that's the real reason why Trump is becoming frustrated, because John Bolton has made so many empty promises. And as stupid as Trump is, he can only be lied to so many times, and then eventually he'll be like, come on, what's going on here?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And it does speak to the government and the people of Venezuela and the respect they have for their government, because, I mean, just thinking out loud, I think if somebody tried a coup in America, it would have more success than that, and which is crazy to say that. And I do want to pivot to Iran because we are kind of running out of time. To kind of tie these two together, do you think there was any sort of idea that, okay, Venezuela's going to be like a preseason and Iran's going to be a regular season game, and they were just kind of setting up for what they want to do in Iran, or because they seem to be kind of playing in the same tactics in a lot of ways. Is that just because that's how we do things, or was there some kind of lead up to Iran being the main goal, so to speak? And there's things that they mentioned. Nitro Zeus is one. I've been curious if that was actually used in Venezuela to take Venezuela off their power grid. They've said they're going to use that in Iran. Just kind of wondering about how those two compare.
Well, there's a lot to respond to there. One, on the electricity issue. When I was in Venezuela for a month earlier this year, I never had any electricity issues. Now, there were some water issues, that's true. There are some infrastructural issues, although I've been in many third world countries that also have infrastructural issues, but the water issues in Mexico and Colombia are never blamed on capitalism. But anyway, I digress. There is quite a bit of evidence that suggests that the U.S. has been sabotaging Venezuela's infrastructure. In fact, Marco Rubio has boasted about it on Twitter very explicitly. Pompeo has made many hints. I don't doubt in any way that the U.S. is carrying out cyber attacks against Venezuela's electrical grid. In fact, I made a video for the Gray Zone, where a website I help run with Max Blumenthal, an investigative journalism website, thegrayzone.com. And we published a video showing how, in fact, in some popular video games, like Call of Duty, there are missions in Venezuela where they actually reenact putting a virus inside Caracas, Venezuela's electricity grid and putting out the light. So this is not in any way some kind of extreme science fiction idea. As you mentioned, there's a lot of evidence that the U.S. has been carrying out cyber attacks against Iran. So why wouldn't they do it against Venezuela as well? Now, on the issue of Venezuela and the warmongering, I want to answer this question pretty carefully, but I'll just first say I don't think the U.S. can realistically wage war. Now, I said carefully because it's possible that John Bolton is so insane and so pathological that Trump is so stupid, frankly, that he could actually go along with this war idea. But the reason I say I don't think it's possible is for a variety of geopolitical reasons. I simply don't think it's in the cards. One, let's talk about Venezuela for a second. Is the U.S. going to invade Caracas? Are they going to send, what is that going to look like? First of all, the Venezuelan military is enormous, and it would unite the Venezuelan military and people who aren't even a huge fan of Maduro against the U.S. invasion, because U.S. intervention would be very unpopular. So it's very unlikely that the U.S. would directly invade. An election is coming up, and Trump is worried about approval ratings, and a lot of this Venezuela and Iran saber-rattling is, in fact, I think, partially domestic to rile up his base as we're coming into the beginning of the 2020 presidential campaign. And that's why he gave his big anti-Venezuela speech in Miami and Florida, which is a key swing state. And in addition to that, okay, let's say the U.S. can't realistically send troops into Caracas. Let's say Colombia and Brazil send troops in. Colombia is going through a peace process with the FARC. It's a very complicated situation politically. I don't know if they, I don't think they, who knows? I don't think they could realistically send in troops. Now, they might send in Contras to wage a kind of terror war, and I think that's actually the most likely possibility. Instead of a conventional war, you have an unconventional, decentralized guerrilla warfare campaign of terrorism, just like we saw against Nicaragua in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. I think that's the most likely scenario.
And that was under John Bolton as well, right?
Well, not Bolton, but it was under Elliot Abrams. Elliot Abrams oversaw that, who is the special envoy in Venezuela. And then finally, there's the issue of Brazil. It looked maybe a few months ago like it would have been maybe possible for Brazil to send troops, but at home in Brazil, there's a massive rebellion going on against Bolsonaro, the fascist president who was elected there, and he's extremely unpopular, and he's been unable to govern, he's sick, and in addition to that, he's dealing with the huge corruption scandal and implication in assassinations, including the assassination of a major left-wing activist. So for a variety of geopolitical reasons, not to mention the fact that China, Russia, India, South Africa, the African Union, all of these countries, even Turkey, a NATO member, are standing with the elected government of Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela. So there's a huge international fracturing which prevents action at the UN. There's no way that a UN resolution can go through. And in addition to that, even in Europe, there's been fracturing. So Germany is not entirely on board in the same way. Even France is kind of fracturing. So the U.S. doesn't have the support it would need. Now, it's true, John Bolton is a maniac. He's a complete unrepentant warmonger. It's possible that he could try to launch a war. And similarly for Iran. But the thing is, in Venezuela, they would lose the war. It would be a horrifically destructive war, but they would lose it. And in Iran, oh my God, it's a whole different level. In Iran, the Venezuelan military is big, but it doesn't have a lot of experience. The Iranian military, they have experience fighting against Saddam Hussein in the 1980s in an 8-year war. They have hardened generals who are ideologically committed to the Iranian Revolution. They have allies. They're not proxies. The media always says proxies. They have allies in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Palestine, and other countries. If the U.S. actually launched a conventional war in Iran, it would immediately erupt into an international war across the entire Middle East, which the U.S. has already been waging. The war in Syria was an international war, but it would make the war in Syria look like child's play. That led to the death of hundreds of thousands of people. We're talking about such a catastrophic crime that could even potentially bring in Russia, that could potentially bring in China and Turkey. So the thing is, that was a long answer, like a lot of my answers, but the point is that these issues are complex, and it's possible that, as stupid as Trump is, he could be convinced into one of the most insane ideas imaginable, a war with Iran. But the point I'm making is, for a variety of geopolitical reasons, Europe would not be on board. I just don't see how the Trump administration could do that. So I think the strategy is not actually a conventional war. The media is using these scare tactics, like reporting on this meeting that they had, talking about all these troops to be sent to the Middle East. I think these are scare tactics that are being used to justify the blatantly illegal other forms of indirect warfare against Iran. The sanctions, which are blatantly illegal. Trump was the only leader to withdraw from the international Iran nuclear deal, which was agreed to not just by the US and Iran, but also by Russia, China, the European Union, France, Britain, Germany. All of these countries are still signatories to the JCPOA, and they're still abiding by this agreement. Only the US has withdrawn and has illegally reimposed sanctions on Iran, which is another form of collective punishment and economic warfare that is harming Iranian civilians and preventing the government from importing medicine and medical equipment, just like in Venezuela. These are the wars. The wars are already being waged. And for a variety of international reasons, in a reflection of the decline of the U.S. empire, I simply don't see how the U.S. could wage a conventional war on these countries. And that itself, the fact that after the illegal invasion of Iraq, the U.S. cannot carry out another similar illegal war, is a reflection of how U.S. power has been in decline since the invasion of Iraq. And we have seen the rise of countries like China, Russia, even Turkey, even India, that are increasingly acting independently and putting a check on U.S. power and preventing it from wreaking havoc across the planet. Now, it's possible that the Trump administration is just so insane that they could wage a war, but that would be the end of the U.S. empire. The U.S. empire is already spiraling out of control. That would be the Nero burning Rome, fiddling his violin as Rome burns. That would be the moment of complete destruction. And hopefully we don't get to that moment.
No, I agree with you, too, in the fact that we already are at war. Because it seems like that's kind of how we fight wars. We find a country, we sanction them, we pretty much close them off, and we suffocate them from the inside out. We push for uprisings and coups, and we get behind that, and then we take what we need. We couldn't fight Iran like in a conventional war. Their military is what, 4 times larger than Iraq, and we're still in Iraq. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I did just want to touch base on that because there has been a lot of talk about, especially like you were saying, with 120,000 troops heading there, the carriers, and you know, yeah, like with Iraq, we didn't even wait. We just said, hey, we're going to bomb you guys. And we haven't really done that with Iran. We've just been goading them. What do you think would happen if they did retaliate?
Well, I think that's a big part of this, is that the U.S. has been trying to poke the bear, if you will. Although in this case, the U.S. is the horrific grizzly bear and Iran is the small little rabbit. I mean, Iran has never been the aggressor in the past 40 years. This is so outlandish. The U.S. has been terrorizing Iran since 1953, when the CIA overthrew Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, on behalf of oil companies, specifically BP, British Petroleum, which was at the time the Anglo-Iranian oil company. So since 1953, we've been terrorizing this country. The U.S. propped up the Shah, the absolute monarch. The U.S. supported the brutal Savak, the feared Iranian secret police that were torturing and kidnapping activists, and they were operating freely within U.S. borders. The Shah's reign of terror was overseen by the U.S. And then the U.S. supported Saddam Hussein as he used chemical weapons against Iran in the 1980s to try to crush the Iranian Revolution. So Iran has always been the victim. The fact that it has not retaliated that much is actually very impressive, and it's a reflection of the patience, the incredible patience of the Iranian government. Now, whatever you think about the Iranian government, I'm not trying to portray it as some great government. I'm not a supporter of theocracy at all. I'm avowedly secular. You know, there are issues with the Iranian government. But when you look at the international stage, it's just an objective fact that Iran's foreign policy has been in support of peace, and the U.S. has been the one pushing for war. The U.S. has been the one waging proxy war against Iran through Syria. The U.S. has been, and Israel, a major U.S. proxy and ally, Israel has repeatedly, hundreds of times, bombed Iranian targets and Iranian allies inside Syria. And the fact that Iran has barely retaliated against Israel because it knows that Israel will launch a war is a reflection, again, of the patience of Iran. They're waiting this whole thing out. But it's also a reflection of the hubris of the empire. You can only do things so much, and eventually there will be pushback. And the Iranian pushback is indirect, because it knows that it can't wage a conventional strike, or the U.S. would use that to justify war. So I think that's been the Trump administration's strategy, is that the U.S. is going to keep poking and poking and poking and poking and poking, attacking Iranian allies, attacking Iranian targets, sabotaging the Iranian economy. And then if Iran does respond and retaliate in some way with a missile attack, with some kind of attack, then the U.S. will use that as justification for further aggression. Just in the same way as Israel is trapping nearly 2 million Palestinians in a concentration camp in Gaza, controlling the food and everything that goes in, suffocating people. I mean, they have no lives, preventing them from leaving, holding them hostage, and then as soon as some Palestinians fire back in self-defense, Israel uses it as an excuse to launch dozens of airstrikes and to level parts of Gaza. It's a strategy of the media obscures the aggressor and then portrays the people acting in self-defense as if they were the ones who inspired the attack, and then Israel is just retaliating. Similarly, that's the same U.S. strategy against Iran. But like I said, it's a waiting game. The U.S. can only do it for so long, and the U.S. empire is declining. Its own allies in Europe are, even to an extent, not strongly, but kind of quietly rebelling against this policy, because not necessarily for progressive reasons, but because French and British capitalists, they want to do business with Iran. And Iran is a large economy. And now the U.S. is threatening its own allies with secondary sanctions, including India, Turkey, France, Britain, with including South Korea and Japan. The U.S. is threatening these countries with secondary sanctions if they continue to buy oil from Iran. That policy of being the big bully, the world's bully, can only work for so long. And eventually some people, including U.S. allies, are just going to stand up and say, no, I'm not going along with this. And the fact that Turkey, a major U.S. ally and NATO member, that's the beginning of the fracture. And I'm certainly no fan of Erdogan, who's a reactionary and has his own issues. But the fact that even Turkey is now exercising its own independent foreign policy and is actually not being as aggressively anti-Iran as the U.S. wants, and is actually recognizing the elected government of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, that is the first sign of the unraveling of this international system. So, yes, it's sad and it's unjust and it's criminal that the U.S. can continue with these forms of aggression unchecked, but the Trump administration is accelerating that decline further and further, and there's only so much longer that they can continue to carry out these aggressive policies.
Yeah, especially with the secondary sanctions. I mean, I know that they're waiting. Well, I don't know, but I could guess that one of the benefits of Iran retaliating would be that they could garner more allies to help them, to help us, if you will. But yeah, as you were saying with those sanctions, you're gonna have a lot more of our allies that pull back and not help like we would want them to. I did want to ask you one more thing in regarding Iran. Is there any are there any signs that we might be more aggressive in the future, or is this kind of just a long waiting game, like you were saying? Like, is there a goal? I should also say that. That's probably a better answer or question.
The goal is very clear. The Trump administration says it itself. The goal is regime change, which is a polite term. The goal is overturning these independent governments in Iran, Venezuela, and any other country, and installing right-wing neoliberal governments that will be loyal to Washington and that will follow America's orders. Those are the goals. They say it very clearly. Those were also the goals under Obama. He was just much more implicit about it. He was much more careful. He didn't say it so. He didn't say the soft parts loudly, and the loud parts quietly. So we know the goals, and the tactics are complete, total war on the civilian populations of these countries through economic warfare, crippling the Iranian and Venezuelan economies, also the Cuban and Nicaraguan economies, and anyone who stands in the U.S. way, and trying to prevent their governments from being able to continue governing by preventing the government from importing medicine and food, by sabotaging the economy, by isolating the countries in the international market, by preventing them from getting access to international capital and loans. Those are the tactics, and we know the goals. And unfortunately, I think it's a matter of waiting. We don't know what they're going to do, but they're already waging war against the civilian populations of Iran, of Venezuela, and of other countries. And like I said, it's only a matter of time until that bubble bursts and it begins to backfire. And it is backfiring. But in the meantime, the unfortunate truth is that Venezuelan, Iranian, Cuban, Yemeni, Nicaraguan, and many other people, these civilian populations, they are the ones who are suffering from these policies.
Without a doubt. And I think that there's so much to be said about that. And honestly, I'd love to keep going. We have to let you go, though. Before we do, though, I did want to ask you, aside from the Gray Zone, is there anything else that you're currently working on?
Yeah, so just to replug that, I help run the website The Gray Zone with Max Blumenthal, and we have a lot of exciting things coming out of there soon, including some Venezuela, Iran coverage, and other issues. That is The Gray Zone, American spelling with an A.com. And in addition to that, I co-host a podcast and video show with Max Blumenthal called Moderate Rebels, and you can find that online at every, iTunes, Spotify, every platform. That is Moderate Rebels, and you can check us out there.
And where else can people find you? On Facebook, Twitter, all those outlets?
Yeah, of course. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. If you just look up Ben Norton, it's pretty easy to find me.
All right, great. I'm such a huge fan, and thank you for raising the IQ on our show quite a bit. Thank you so much. We'd love to have you back. Again, thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for letting me rant. It's always good because everyone, when you interview, usually they try to keep it short. So I'm also grateful to you for letting me help to explain some of these issues in more detail.
That's why we wanted to get you on. And anytime you want to come back on, I'm sure we'll probably bug you in 3-6 months again and have you back on.
I'd be happy to anytime.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Have a great day.
Talk to you soon. And keep up the good work. It's very important that we have alternative media around the country and around the world like you all And I know it's very thankless work. So thank you for, being a good person. And it's cliche, but thank you for being a good citizen, because we need people who are going to help make their communities and their societies better by doing this kind of thankless work.
You've definitely made my day. Thank you so much, Beth. Have a great rest of your day.
Of course, you too.
And that was the Ben Norton.
Oh my God, that was awesome.
Are you excited?
The thing is, I could have kept going.
I think he would have kept going too. That was an amazing interview.
I felt so dumb because I wasn't comfortable, and so I was stepping over myself. I would get in there pretty good, and then I fuck up what I'm saying.
You know that scene from Wayne's World where they finally get to meet Alice Cooper?
I don't want to hear it.
And they go back there and they just know that they're going to be smart and they're going to have something intelligent to say. And then Alice Cooper goes off on this tangent about the Indians and how smart he is, and Wayne and Garth just dropped to the news saying we're not worthy.
I know.
You just want to do that, don't you?
I honestly do, because as anyone's going to listen to this, they're going to tell within 2 minutes of him just, I think you put it best, and you kind of wrote it down. The guy speaks 14 different languages, but we barely speak English.
Right?
I'm sitting here blabbing over trying to find certain words to use, and he's eloquently dancing around me with no problem, and I'm glad I'm on his side. I'll definitely say that.
I think it's amazing. 90%, I'll say 99% of the time, because I know there was one time when we do interviews, most of the time nobody knows what we're going to ask. Nobody knows what is going to be said. He was prepared. He knew his shit.
Yeah, he didn't even have to. And we didn't go over anything. Very basic. In fact, the beginning of the interview was just kind of free form. But yeah, and we've had this conversation too, where I've told you I'm not afraid of anyone in a debate circle.
He would fuck us up.
Terrified.
And I feel like sometimes Cody and we could probably BS our way through it. No, this dude would kill us. He would kill us. And I do appreciate the fact that the first part of our interview, he talked about the importance of your news sources and the validity of them.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh my God.
Well, and that's why I did want to set the table up, so to speak, saying, look, we're not you. And what you guys
not
do.
you.
We aspire to be that way. I come into the studio all the time, and I feel like I probably dickly say it. I don't know if dickly is a word, but I tell you guys, we're not those guys.
No, we're not.
We're not good enough. But on the other turn, we do have other aspects that maybe they don't. I don't know. They could probably make really rude jokes as well,
yes.
like we do. But it was just a pleasure to have him on.
I appreciate the fact that he actually promotes different news sources. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And
I honestly didn't know that he was a founder of the Gray Zone.
I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, guys, we've got to let you go because we've been doing this, well, not normally as long as we do our show, but we still got places to be. We didn't expect to be this long of an adventure. Anyway, we're going to try something new on Friday. That'll be interesting to see how that works.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, tonight in the Midwest, we've got more rain coming down. Tonight is Wednesday night, by the way, if this gets put up later. Thursday, more and more rain.
All
Our
damn
studio
day.
is already flooding.
It is very flooded.
And that's only going to get worse. So we're going to try to Skype the show on Friday, and we're going to, hopefully that turns out well.
I hope so.
Again, thank you guys for tuning in for this special interview. This meant the world to me, and just so happy to have someone like Ben Norton appear. It gives us a little bit of credibility. Anyway, take care, guys.